I want to thank each panelist. It was great information. You noticed that included in your packet are writings from each one of the panelists, and in a couple of cases, 2 or 3. Also included in your document is a report done by the AFT, Reclaiming the Promise of Racial Equity. It was done by our Racial Equity Task Force. Great reading, and it would give you an insight into what AFT is doing to address the level of racism. It's amazing how in the reports, many of you are used implicit bias. I just call it straight out racism. And so how do, I'm gonna start this question out. One, I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, and I was bused from one end of a community to the other end. And so even in the afternoon, my choices were limited based on getting home out of a neighborhood that was already racist to get back home in time before it got dark. And I know, and you discussed my options. My options are limited by being forced to go to a school and choosing to do extracurricular activity, which means I chose to then take public transportation back home, running often, in a situation. And so how can government or there be policies that would rely on those options that were not mine? It was not my choice to go to this school. I passed 3 and 4 schools on my way. And so if you could address that for me, please.
Well, you've just
yes.
You've just introduced like all of the complicating factors.
That's it. Yeah.
And
get to the point.
I actually don't know exactly how to do it. I know we have to ask. And so these are really important things. We don't talk about pupil transportation. You think about the reams and reams of research that are out there and these tons of journals. They're all about, what we can do to make the classroom better. And there's almost nothing on, well, what does it mean for a kid to take an hour school bus ride? I don't know. What does it mean if you miss the school bus and then you have to, get home on public transportation? I think the first thing we have to do is look at this as a holistic, the life of the child. And so what might we do? We might really think about putting limits on how long a kid can be on a bus, how far they can go. Make sure that maybe we have a second bus. Maybe there's a night bus. There's the after-school bus. Certainly in private schools, there are buses, and they'll do that to pick you up later. But more than that, I think you didn't describe how you had options back in your, where you lived. What if there was after-school programs and opportunities where you lived? What if there were, we didn't sort of couple that all and put it on the school? We could think about that. I think we do have examples of those things that work. I grew up in a funny part of New York where it was a pretty new neighborhood that was built in slum clearance, and a whole lot of us went to a community center that was built as part of the public housing project. All over the neighborhood, kids went there. I think it's a successful public housing project, so we shouldn't think that they're all big disasters, because I don't think this one was. We could build more of those. We could invest more in these things. It's not a single bullet solution, but we got to start asking that question. What does this feel to the life of the child? What does that mean?
Thank you. I will have a question. Yesterday, the Obama administration's budget called for a $120 million program to promote socioeconomic diversity in schooling. This is the first time a president has proposed a new program for integration in decades. What political constituencies might come together to support new programs like this? It's open for any one of the panelists.
I'll make a comment. Let's get real. We're living in a polarized political system where nothing's going to get done. It's no matter what gets proposed, it's not going to get done. So the question to me is not, it's self-indulgent to talk about policies that we should now pursue. I can come up with dozens and dozens of them. The problem is, how do we politically change the consciousness of this country? And we need to start with progressives, because even progressives don't have an understanding of the challenges of segregated schools and segregated neighborhoods. So rather than focus, it seems to me, on policies that Obama may propose or somebody else may propose, we need to focus instead on how can we conduct a public education campaign to educate the American people about the nature of this problem. And let me just, if I can tell you, an example. You know, I looked at American history textbooks that are used in high schools all around the country. And I looked, give an example. The most common American history textbook today used in high schools is something called The Americans. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's got 1,200 pages. In that textbook of 1,200 pages, there's one paragraph devoted to with segregation in the North. And within that one paragraph, there's one sentence devoted to housing. And the sentence reads as follows. In the North, African Americans found themselves in segregated neighborhoods. You know, they woke up one day and they said, whoopie-doo, here we are in a segregated neighborhood. Now, if that's what we're teaching our young people, and I'm not just talking about white young people, black people are being taught this as well. If that's what we're teaching our young people, then the next generation is going to be as incapable of addressing this problem as our generation has been. So it seems to me the first step is how do we accelerate the conversation that's just barely begun as a result of the killings of black youth in places like Ferguson and Baltimore and the rest of the country. How do we accelerate that conversation so there can be a possibility of talking about serious policy?
Another question. What has to happen? What is the revolution that must happen to bring equality, equity to housing and education?
I could just build on what Richard just said. If we don't have a lot of hope in the policymakers doing this, I do think this public education campaign and really creating more of a grassroots effort, because I do hear, I've interviewed probably in the last 20 years thousands of parents on these kinds of issues and of racial segregation, and I actually know that the policies are not matching what a lot of parents say and know intuitively about preparing their children for the future. And so we do have a lot of structures in place, and people with privilege and money and racial privilege are able to operate in that system so that they have some economic advantage. But even a lot of those parents are not happy with the status quo, because the educational system is just focused way too much on testing, not enough on social emotional development, and there's too much stress, okay? And then also they know intuitively it's probably not a good thing for their kids to be educated in really segregated white communities. So, and then they go on college tours and all these universities are touting their racially diverse student bodies, and I'm looking around the room with my son, I'm thinking, are these kids coming from these segregated high schools ready for this, right? So maybe we ought to start really refocusing the goals of education and pushing for that more from the community level in these pockets of diversity that I've been looking at, where there's this moment of possibility, and really engaging parents and educators around these benefits of diverse schools and shining a light on those examples as models for the rest of the country, and starting it really more from the grassroots. And I do think, I mean, we do see in New York City there's some attention being paid at the city level in terms of the policies and the politics because of the noise being made around these issues. So it's not all good, it's not all progressive, but at least it's on a radar screen. So I do think the change will come more from the bottom up, as so many of the important movements in this country have. So,
We have a question from our Twitter. It's what cities or states have done a good job with segregation and equitable housing?
In housing.
I think you quoted a couple of cities.
Well, you know, I would say
Louisville, I think you
Louisville.
said. Well, somebody said Louisville.
I said that.
yeah, I think it depends on what we're thinking of. I mean, if you think about public housing, for example, you know, for all of the complaining about public housing in New York, and there's a lot to complain about, there are good public housing projects there. And, you know, so you know, I'm an economist, and so I've had an opportunity to hear the long discussion about why we should focus on people and not places. which would say, help people, give them housing vouchers. Don't build new housing, give people money and they'll go other places. And I think now it's time for us to kind of come back from that a bit. So there are examples where place-based housing investment matters and has, there's some really good examples. There are lots of bad examples, but we haven't been paying attention to it for a while. So we could do something maybe by looking at the good examples and replicating those.
Is there anyone else? Okay, have another question. Knowing that funding is closely related to location, what are current secure routes to strengthening neighborhoods?
You want to just say that again?
Yeah.
Okay. Whoever wrote that question, and we want you to add, knowing that funding is closely related to location.
Okay, so let me jump into this. I want to say something really important. Funding it depends a lot on your district and not your neighborhood in that, and that's actually a pretty important distinction. And so some years ago, we did some studies looking at the distribution of funding across schools in several big districts, and they've been done over the years. You could look at funding, you could look at teachers, you could look at different resources. And what's interesting is that in New York City and sometimes elsewhere, that the distribution of money inside the school district is sort of pro-poverty. So meaning the poorer schools get more. It's just not that much more. So if you look across districts, poorer districts typically have less money. They have less property values. They tax less. And we've done a lot to try to shore that up. And some states have done a really remarkable job crossing the district boundaries. Closing the disparities across districts, and we've seen improvements in educational outcomes for this. But what goes on inside a district is a completely different thing. It's really hard to change, but it's not true that the neighborhood characteristics sort of directly affect the amount the school gets. It's much more about the school characteristics. So it's not that poor neighborhoods get less or more. Schools with more poor kids get more because of Title I, because of other funding programs.
Well, on Long Island, Title I isn't going to offset the property value differences. So, I mean,
but that's a within versus between districts issue, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the interesting thing right now is in urban areas, you're starting to see schools in gentrifying communities where they're losing the Title I funding, and in suburban areas where schools are for the first time starting to get Title I funding. So, so this concentration of poverty and the hope that Title I will solve the problem is not playing out. Because segregation just keeps happening. And I think we really have to address the issue of why is separate unequal. So it goes beyond tangible factors like funding, and it goes into these perceptions of place and the status and reputation. If you go back to the Supreme Court cases before Brown versus Board of Ed, to the higher education cases, when the Supreme Court was talking about the status of a university, University of Texas versus a separate segregated law school created in Texas for black students. And a lot of that was about intangible factors, right? About the reputation and the status of a law school. And because they were lawyers on the Supreme Court, they understood that status and reputation mattered. Okay, and the Supreme Court in the Brown decision also talks about intangible factors. So it's not just about equalizing tangibles, which we haven't really done a very good job of that either in this country. But even if we could, there is something inherently unequal about separation that I think relates to these perceptions of place, these stigmas, these stereotypes, this differential status that does lead to a downward spiral in terms of property values and tangible factors in the long run. And there's several examples of that in places where demographics have changed rapidly. So,
I'd like to just pick up on that a little bit. There's some really nice ethnographic research on if you ask people where the good schools are, they can't even tell you sometimes what they base their decisions on. They just know where the good schools are. They know X is a good school and Y isn't. And sometimes that's related to test scores, and sometimes it's not. And sometimes parents don't even know what the test scores are that are associated with those good schools. So there's this very interesting reputational quality that schools get. That does, in fact, have ramifications for who moves there, what the property values become. There's some nice research out of Stanford right now. Sean Reardon is doing research on how Socioeconomic inequality among school districts is increasing. And it's increasing at the very top end. It's not increasing between the poor and the non-poor. It's increasing between the rich and the non-rich. So some people are very able to take advantage of moving into schools with this high reputational, these high reputations, high status reputations, and other people cannot.
Again, those that are joining us by Twitter, the hashtag is @segregatedschools. Another question here is, has any location or school district figured out a way to fund schools without using property taxes?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah. I mean, this varies enormously across the country. There are many states that use property taxes very little. That question obviously comes from someone in the Northeast who's in a district that relies heavily on property taxes. But that's not true nationwide. In fact, overall, on average, schools get more money from state funding than from local property taxes, and it varies enormously from state to state.
Okay, why do you think there is increasing attention paid to school segregation after so many years of neglect? Is there an effect of investment of whites moving back to cities or something else?
I think it's a combination of factors. I think it's the changing demographics of the country. Fall 2014 was the first year that the K through 12 public school population was less than 50% white, non-Hispanic. I think it has to do with the millennial generation with their very different attitudes about race, and which gives me a lot of hope, even though it's, we don't really know the depth of it, but or how it interacts with all these structures, but there's something hopeful there. And then I just think that if you interview gentrifiers, white people moving into cities, they say the suburbs were boring, and they say they grew up in the suburbs. Their grandparents fled to the suburbs from the cities that they're moving back into. So they say they want to raise their kids in more cosmopolitan places. Now, of course, they bring a lot of white privilege and often economic privilege with them to that context. So that's where we have to do some hard work around. What does that really mean to be in a diverse community? What does that mean for your children to be in a diverse school? How complicated is that? How are you privileged in this context? And what can we do about that? So those are hard conversations to have, but they all give me some hope that there's a lot of change happening. I think the recent incidents from Ferguson to Baltimore and New York City, where we have a case trial right now on a shooting of a black young man without a gun in a stairwell of a housing project, ironically enough. And so I think all of these things happening at once, and we realize we're in a global economy. We hear employers say they want people prepared for a global workforce and able to cross cultural boundaries. We hear the universities say it loudly in their affirmative action cases that there are benefits to diverse contexts and diverse schools. They say they want children who are prepared for those contexts. I think there's just a lot of movement in this direction and a lot of energy going towards this. We just don't quite know what we're going to do with it and how policymakers can and should respond. And that's why I think the grassroots, the public campaign, changing the public view of how we think about this and talk about this would be really helpful right now.
I'd point to a few other things as well. We spent an awful lot of time over the last couple of decades on addressing the inequality in spending across school districts. I mean, school finance reform and increasing spending occupied a big place in the agenda. And at the same time, accountability reform and school-based accountability, no child left behind, following this idea we were going to get greater equality across races, and I want to sort of say again, socioeconomic groups. I think it's not just black-white, it's black-white, Asian, Hispanic, an increasingly complicated world, and it's also about a class divide. But we have better and better data on this, more and more years. We've tried accountability, it's had some effects. We tried school finance reform, it had some effects. But none of these things were magic bullets. There was no, now we do this and it goes away. And so now folks are kind of coming back and saying, so what else is there? It does seem to me that we also want to think about what's that third piece? We have what are the school resources that we observe, and they're the demographic characteristics, and we keep talking about how, when the percentage black goes up, what happens. Thing is that's not the only thing that moves. There's also changes in the neighborhoods of other kinds, changes in institutions, changes in the socioeconomic status, changes in those characteristics, and our ability to capture all those things and disentangle those things is limited. We have a big blind spot that I think we need to try to get past and start looking at these things now that we know that pressuring the schools isn't just going to solve the problem.
Question: teachers' observation. Teachers are also segregated in schools. Do you have any observations on this? Have any of you studied the segregation of teachers within schools?
Well, so I haven't studied this personally, but there's actually a nice body of research out there. I actually don't know about segregation of, within the school building. That I don't know. But if you look across schools and across districts, there's some nice evidence that, teachers want to teach at schools that are close to where they live, and often, where they're from. So, you're sort of and they want to teach kids like them. They want to teach in good neighborhoods, in neighborhoods that are safe, close to where the transportation is. All the same things you think about when you look at a job. Teachers are just like other people. And, so if you're in a dangerous neighborhood or one that's in fairness, perceived to be dangerous, it's hard to get teachers to go there. And if you're located in a neighborhood that has produced few teachers, and from its own graduates, you're kind of doubly disadvantaged.
Okay. While we think about the equal distribution of effective teachers, which is now language that has been included in the recently passed ESSA Act, in what ways do implicit bias plays a role, if any, in which teachers end up at high-need schools? Are there any recommendations on how to counteract this?
So I looked at this a little bit recently, not in any depth, and it's certainly not my main focus, but we do know that teachers who are in more segregated schools, more minority-dominated segregated schools, are more likely to leave. They're more likely to be there for less than 3 years than teachers in predominantly white schools. We know that they're less likely to get master's degrees, to the extent that master's degrees matter. There's some evidence that they do. The more credentialed the teacher, oftentimes that correlates to student outcomes. So we know those things. Some things that have been suggested are to focus really on allowing for some teacher professionalization, so to move away from some of the accountability standards that we've been holding teachers to, and allow for more professionalization opportunities, and certainly to allow for the fact that teachers who are teaching in minority segregated schools are often in neighborhoods with less resources. They need extra support. They need extra time. There needs to be some idea that these are not comparable to more resource-rich schools. These teachers have more difficult jobs, and so there need to be more supports in those schools for teachers rather than less, which is often the case given the funding available to districts like Philadelphia.
Again, to those who are joining us online, the hashtag is @segregatedschools. Amy Ellen Schwartz, this question is directed to you. Can you please speak to the predominantly white charter schools in racially diverse areas? How do we reckon with impulse to self-segregate as we promote integration in the era of choice?
You know what? It's a great question, because we also have the flip side, right? Which is all black charter schools in neighborhoods that are not all black. I don't have a good answer for that. I know it's a true thing, right? It's not the only thing, right? It's certainly not the only, but we know that we see that school choice, where people are able to choose, have some flexibility in which school that, they're not choosing integrated schools in sufficient number that it's changing the overall segregation. So I don't know. I think we have to think about location, we have to think about the articulation policies and sort of think about where they are, but it's a problem. While I think Richard's right that the segregation we see isn't entirely about, and maybe not predominantly about homophily and people wanting to live with people like them, that's not to say that isn't also a force, that people want to choose schools together. I don't know what to do.
Richard, would you like to add to that?
Sure,
question?
but this is a much more
Okay.
this is a much more complicated issue than that. Let me. We were talking before about Louisville. Louisville, Kentucky was one of the districts that was the subject of the Supreme Court decision in 2007 that prohibited token integration policy on the basis of the fact that Louisville was segregated de facto. Well, I know a little bit about Louisville. In the 1950s, for example, a white family sold a home in the suburb of Shively to an African-American Navy veteran.
Yes.
And the state of Kentucky indicted, prosecuted, and
Yes.
jailed the white seller for sedition. There were bombs thrown in the home. The home was firebombed. That was in the 1950s. 30 years later, another black family attempted to buy a home in the suburb of Sylvania. And the same thing happened. There wasn't an indictment for sedition, but firebombing with police complicity, all of these with police complicity. So when we talk about people preferring to live in segregated neighborhoods, we have to understand that preferences are constructed not just by sort of pulled out of thin air, but by a history of violence, state-supported violence, that took place whenever African Americans attempted to integrate white neighborhoods. So what we need to do is create I'm not contradicting myself, it's not going to happen in the near future unless we understand this history of Louisville, for example, and the history of other cities like this around the country. Once we understand that, we will understand the necessity of creating structures that change people's preferences, that create such a welcoming environment for families that integrate that they will choose. We will create incentives to choose integrated neighborhoods. Right now, we have 2 federal programs that support low-income families' housing. Not, all these examples of violence were middle-class families trying to move into white neighborhoods. This wasn't going to reduce the average socioeconomic status of these neighborhoods. These were middle-class African-American families. But we have 2 federal programs in the housing area now that support low-income families' housing. One is, as you probably know, called the Section 8 Housing Voucher Program. It gives families vouchers that subsidize their rents so that they can live in, they can afford to rent apartments. The other is a program it's much, much bigger actually. It's run by the Federal Treasury Department called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, which subsidizes developers to build low-income housing. Both of those programs exacerbate segregation because they are both used disproportionately to place families in already segregated neighborhoods. Low-income housing tax credit developments are mostly in already segregated low-income neighborhoods. Housing vouchers are mostly used. We have a national system where landlords are permitted to reject Section 8 housing vouchers, and typically in white middle-class neighborhoods, they're rejected. So now those could be fixed. Again, I'm not contradicting myself. I'm not saying that we should go around and try to fix them because there's no political support for fixing them now. But we need to understand that these policies continue to support. There's a long waiting list now for Section 8 vouchers, long waiting list. Now, some people on that waiting list, and many of the programs in many cities have been closed because there aren't enough vouchers to go around. It's not an entitlement program. Well, many of the people who want Section 8 housing vouchers would prefer to live in segregated neighborhoods. We should give a preference, a priority, to people who choose to live in integrated neighborhoods. Since there's a limited number of vouchers around, why not give a preference to integration? We're not going to do that given the current political environment. So again, we need to emphasize changing the national conversation But there are things we could do to affect these preferences and to demonstrate examples of successful integration. Now, there are a couple of places in this country where they do have programs that encourage families. Baltimore is one of them as a result of a lawsuit, and that encourage families to choose integration, to choose high opportunity neighborhoods when they take a voucher, and it gives preference to those families. But they're very, very rare, and the political environment doesn't exist to expand that program very much.
Can I
Amy
say-
Wells?
Yeah, one more thing about school choice policy. If you look at the history of school choice policy in this country, and lo and behold, it didn't begin with Chubb and Moe's book in 1991, that we've actually used choice in lots of different ways, right? So choice is a means to an end, right? So it depends on how we design the policy. So we once gave white kids vouchers to go to segregated schools, so that was a voucher plan of school choice, right? We once had quote-unquote freedom of choice plans in the South as a way to get around implementing school desegregation that was really not about choice at all. And then we moved into an era of school desegregation where actually choice was used quite a bit. The Magnet Schools of America group is down the street is a room full of people today who could tell you all about that, right? So we created choice schools, magnet schools, for the purpose of integration. We created voluntary transfer plans for the purpose of integration. And then we decided that the market was the answer to all of our problems in education, and that we had to give consumers choice, unregulated, deregulated choice, and creating no support system in place with those policies for transportation, for outreach, or for integration guidelines, okay? So the current era of school choice policies has led to more racial segregation and not less. It shouldn't be a surprise to us, given the basis of those policies, what they were designed to do, and the way they were written. So it's really not rocket science. Like, we just need to rethink the policies if the goal is integration, right? If the goal is just the market and competition and privatizing public education, then maybe we don't care that they're more segregated. That seems to be the political will right now. But I think what Richard's saying, what I'm saying, what several of us are hopefully saying, is that we can change that will. We just have to face the reality of it.
So I just want to say one thing about this thing about the housing vouchers. You know, when you look at where our housing voucher holders move to, and I've done some work on this, looking at what happens when you get a housing voucher. You know, it's not such an easy thing. You know, you have 60 days from the day you qualify, or something like that, to use the voucher, to lease up. So you've been on this waiting list forever. You finally get the housing voucher. You have 60 days. If you don't use it, you lose it. And you have a million things that are on your plate to do, and lots of things you're looking for. And a lot of people don't actually end up using it because they can't find a place. And so, and we do see in our work that, families with kids of school age do move toward better schools, but they have a lot of constraints. And it's not like there's lots of open housing that fits the bill, that are near better schools, that have all the features that we want. So I'm ambivalent. I guess more than that, I am reluctant to constrain this more, just because I think these are not the people. These are not the people that I want to constrain more and tell them where they can live. So sorry, I don't mean to be so negative. If we had a whole lot more money for housing vouchers, if we could change the rules so that we could say that landlords could not discriminate against voucher holders, and there are circumstances, some places we do have those laws. If we had a bigger supply, if we didn't have such a housing supply problem, I could be a bigger fan of that. But I'm worried about squeezing the people who are already on the edge.
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
As I said, there are long waiting lists, so that you don't have to constrain people more. You simply give priority to people who would prefer to move to an integrated neighborhood. And we have examples of successful programs that have done that have given people the counseling and the social support and the help in finding places. The mobility program in Baltimore is one. 30 years ago, the program that emerged from the Grassroots suit in Chicago was another. So we have successful examples of efforts to use the Section 8 voucher program to integrate, but it's a very rare thing. It doesn't. Those programs didn't require more constraints on people. They involved more support for people to move to integrated neighborhoods.
Okay, again, to our online viewers at segregated schools. Another question, what examples have you seen of teacher education or professional development that prepares teachers well for racially and socially economically environments?
That's an excellent question, and could I just...
Diverse environments, I'm sorry.
Right. And we're building that at Teachers College. So we are actually launching a summer institute this summer on teaching and learning in diverse public schools. So there are several people working on this in teacher ed programs where that's maybe a piece of their program, and we're trying to bring it together at TC with a summer institute on that. But there are workshops and there are professional development. There's the teaching tolerance curriculum. There's a lot of pieces of it, but we're trying to pull it together more holistically. So I think the answer is it's fragmented right now, but I think this new momentum that we're building, the changing demographics of the country, the frustration we've seen with TFA teachers about them not addressing that in their teacher preparation, quote unquote, process, that I think we're seeing a pushback and we're seeing more demand for that, and I hope schools of ed will respond, and I know mine is. So.
Okay. We have a last question, and then we'll allow each one of the panelists to sum up their conversations in a couple of minutes. What about the disappointing segregation in charter schools? Where is that coming from?
All right, I'll take a little bit of this, and hopefully I'll be able to address some of it, maybe not head on, but so there's some great new research by Jill Burdick-Wills has just come out with some research that shows that people who use schools of choice, charter schools particularly, are less advantaged than people who are choosing their schools through their home choices, through their residential choices. So there's some circulation among people who choose charter and neighborhood schools, and Burdick-Wills has found that the schools are typically not, at least by measurable test scores and things we can measure, the quality of those schools are not different. So charter schools are appealing to a population that doesn't have a lot of resources to begin with. The population that has a lot of resources is still choosing schools through their homes. It's the most secure way to get the school you want. Charter schools, we know from numerous research, are hard to get into. They're a crapshoot. There are lotteries, there are lines. It's really difficult, it's stressful. Even middle class and upper middle class parents with lots of resources go through terrible stress trying to find their children charter schools if they're living in urban areas where they feel that's what their main desire is. So the group that is moving around through charter schools is not the most advantaged group. The most advantaged group still has the ability to secure high quality schools through their homes. I don't know if that answered the question head on, but.
Yeah. I think it does go back to the policies and the construction of the policies, and as we all know, the charter school policies do vary across states, and some states have better laws than others. But I would maybe define better the way some charter advocates would define better. But most of them do have language in them around racial diversity, and they ask for in the proposals for the school founders to talk about how the schools will reflect the racial makeup of their districts. But my understanding of that, and we need better systematic research on this, is that that's unilaterally ignored in the reauthorization process, that charter schools are not held accountable to that. The other thing is there's the infrastructure in place to support diverse schools amid residential segregation is not there in charter schools. And we're dismantling those kinds of programs in public schools rapidly by dismantling any school desegregation efforts. And so, meanwhile, charter schools are sitting there with most contexts with little transportation. The outreach process is not usually very systematic beyond individual and social networks or local communities. And I think the other factor is that we've decentralized student access and student enrollment in charter schools to the school level. So these lotteries that are well publicized and dramatically so, are very much decentralized and happening at a school level. So there's very little regulation of them in terms of efforts to create more diverse student populations. When you think about school desegregation policies, where those issues were paid attention to, even voluntary choice-based desegregation policies, student access and assignment was taken care of at the district level to abide by the guidelines of diversity. So we're not doing that anymore. It's hard to do that at a school level. We're not sure what the schools are doing in terms of admissions. We're not sure what's happening behind the scenes in the lotteries. But we do know that they're much more segregated than public schools, and that's quite a feat in this era of high segregation.
Great, great. We want to again thank those of you who are part of our online viewers. And again, it's at Segregated Schools. And again, thank those, our international students that have come and visit us today. And now as we close out this section of great conversation, you have a lot of material in your pamphlets. Please read it and contact us at the Albert Shanker Institute if you have any questions, and all of that contact information is also in your pamphlet. And we'll start on the opposite in my far left and come back toward my right for a couple of minutes of closing comments, please.
Well, I've said a lot, so I'm just going to say that I hope that that this grassroots way of looking at it, that I've been looking at it recently after being very frustrated with the policy and political context in this country, is right. And then I do hope that there's enough people, I think, at the community levels where we can have strong examples of really good racially diverse schools and socioeconomically diverse schools, and that they can foster strong, stable, diverse communities amid metro migrations. And then we should really shine a light on those examples, because I think there are a lot of other people out there who would like to see that in their communities, and those aren't the voices that we're hearing right now.
So back to my original concern with this pernicious cycle between residential segregation and school segregation and residential segregation, it's hard to think of ways to break this up. The only shout out I'm going to give is to another scholar, Paul Jargowski, who talks about breaking it up from the housing policy angle. And he has some really nice radical suggestions about how housing policy should be changed, how our zoning policies need to be changed, how local control over those zoning policies really works against school integration, residential integration, and then school integration. He had this wonderfully radical idea that districts have to include some percentage of low-income housing in them in order to allow for some diversity in the schools. And it's a wonderfully radical idea, but I like to think about it every once in a while. When I take the train home tonight, I think about that low-income housing and the opportunities that both the students in the district already and the students who would be moving to the district would have to interact.
So I guess I'd come back where I began. I think it's exciting to think about ways to reduce residential segregation. But while we're doing that, while we're thinking and while we're tinkering, and kids are growing up and life is going by. And so I think I want to talk about first, place-based interventions to make all neighborhoods better. Make these better places for kids to grow up. You make sure every poor neighborhood, every rich neighborhood, they have beautiful libraries that are open all the time, and they have computers, and they have people who know how to help them with what they need to do. Let's make sure they have parks, and they are safe, and they are clean, and they have gyms, and they have summer jobs. And let's think about making sure the kids who come to school get breakfast so nobody's hungry. And, I do work at this nexus of education and housing, and it's because I think they're important to go together. And I think, 20 years from now, I hope we've done something about residential segregation. But in the meantime, all those kids that are born today are going to grow up, and they should grow up in better neighborhoods. And we can do something about that with place-based investments, and maybe spend a lot of money on places.
Well, Amy Wells talked earlier about how the school desegregation case of 1954 began many years earlier with attacks on law school segregation. The NAACP Thurgood Marshall and his mentors and associates had a 20-year strategy to desegregate schools. It wasn't something they started on right away. We have now spent, in this country, probably 50 years now, the last 50 years, debating whether we should do place-based or mobility-type interventions. And of course, everybody, and with all due respect to my friend Amy, all of us, oh, we should do both. But while we're thinking about mobility, we should do something about place-based. And the strategy has been an utter failure. We have tried 50 years of place-based interventions, starting with model cities in the 1950s. President Johnson originally proposed a program to both invest in the inner cities and force suburbs along the lines that Kim was talking about, to accept minorities. That became too difficult, so the mobility part was dropped, and we just focused on model cities. Then we had enterprise zones, and we've had one program after another. And at some point, we've got to decide to get serious about not saying, well, we'll think about mobility, but in the meantime, we'll do place-based, but we need to start getting serious about desegregating this country. And by desegregating the country, I don't mean just desegregating the lowest income families, but we have middle-class segregated suburbs, lower middle-class segregated suburbs, like Prince George's County outside of Washington, where African Americans who have been constrained from living in other suburbs have created a segregated suburb there as well, not through choice, but because they were constrained. We need a fundamental rethinking of our history and our priorities, and it's going to be very difficult if we ever get to address residential segregation. It's much harder. It'll be much more disruptive to desegregate our neighborhoods than it is to pour ineffective money into segregated neighborhoods. But at some point, we've got to start, and as I said earlier, I think the place to start is with a national conversation about how we got here, which we have not had.
I want to thank each one of our panelists for their wonderful input into this conversation, where we live and where we learn. How should we address the effects of residential segregation by race and class on American schools? Please join us by going to shankerinstitute.org for any additional information, as well as Friday, April the 8th, another conversation, the social side of education, how social aspects of schools and school systems shape learning, teaching and learning. Please register at shankerinstitute.org, and thank each and every one of you for this wonderful conversation and dialogue. Please give our panelists an applause. This concludes our program, and again, thank you.